The chalkboard shadow. Maria Rodriguez moved through the quiet, sun-dappled corridors of the Rosewood Senior Living facility with an almost ethereal grace, her footsteps soft, her presence a comforting balm to the residents. At 58, her hands, once small and often chapped from endless chores in her childhood home, were now skilled and gentle, accustomed to the delicate art of caring for the elderly. Her eyes, dark and expressive, held a depth of compassion born from a life of quiet resilience and hard-won dignity. She took immense pride in her work as a certified nursing assistant, seeing each resident not merely as a medical case, a collection of ailments, but as a unique story, a complex tapestry of experiences woven over decades. Rosewood was a modest, yet well-regarded facility in her small, rural Ohio hometown, the very town where she had grown up, where the memories of her childhood still whispered from every familiar street corner, every old brick building, every weathered wooden fence. Part 1. A face from the past, a wound reopened. One brisk Tuesday morning, the usual gentle rhythm of the facility was subtly disrupted by the arrival of a new admission. A frail, almost skeletal man with a shock of thinning white hair and eyes that were glazed with the opaque, distant film of advanced age was carefully wheeled into Rosewood. His name was Mr. Harrison. As Maria approached the gurney, her heart, usually so steady, performed a violent, almost painful leap against her ribs. Her breath caught in her throat, a sudden cold dread seizing her. The name, the distinct, sharp, almost aristocratic nose, the faint outline of a small scar above his left eyebrow, it was undeniable. Her blood ran cold. It was Mr. Harrison, her sixth-grade teacher, the man who had once presided over her classroom with an iron fist, his gaze a constant, cold judgment, and who had relentlessly etched her name, along with so many others, onto the infamous Chalkboard of Shame. A turbulent wave of conflicting emotions washed over Maria. Profound shock, a bitter, acidic surge of old, unhealed resentment, and the unwavering, deeply ingrained professional duty that had become the bedrock of her adult life. This frail, vulnerable man, now completely dependent on the compassionate care of others, was the very same individual who had once wielded chalk like a weapon, his words like stinging whips that left invisible yet deeply painful marks. The irony of the situation was a bitter pill to swallow, dissolving on her tongue, leaving an acrid taste in her mouth. She felt a phantom ache in her chest, a ghost of the humiliation she had carried, a heavy, unspoken burden for decades. With a superhuman effort, Maria forced a professional smile onto her lips, her voice steady, despite the almost imperceptible tremor in her hands. "Welcome to Rosewood, Mr. Harrison. I'm Maria, and I'll be helping you get settled and comfortable." His eyes, though clouded by age and the relentless fog of dementia, seemed to flicker with a faint, almost imperceptible spark of recognition, or perhaps it was just her own overwrought imagination playing tricks on her. She hoped it was her imagination. Part 2. Echoes of the Chalkboard, a childhood revisited. As Maria began the meticulous, day-to-day routine of caring for Mr. Harrison, the past resurfaced with a vivid, almost unbearable clarity, like a relentless old film reel playing in her mind. She was unwillingly transported back to the sweltering, airless classrooms of the 1970s, to the rigid, uncomfortable rows of wooden desks, the monotonous drone of the overhead projector, and the chilling, arctic coldness of Mr. Harrison's perpetually disapproving gaze. He was a stickler for order, for discipline, for what he deemed proper conduct and academic excellence, but his pedagogical methods were steeped in a particularly cruel form of public humiliation, a systematic dismantling of a child's fragile self-esteem. At the front of the classroom, hanging conspicuously beside the standard blackboard, was his custom-made, small yet terrifying Chalkboard of Shame. A dark, foreboding rectangle where he would, with agonizing slowness and deliberate, theatrical precision, write the names of his offenders in stark white chalk, followed by their meticulously detailed transgressions. Maria Rodriguez. Often, too often, her name appeared on that dreaded board, accompanied by the cruel, biting label, dirty. Not because she was unhygienic, her mother insisted on scrupulous cleanliness despite their circumstances, but because her clothes were often worn, patched, and ill-fitting, telltale signs of her family's crushing poverty. Or sometimes, the label would read, Careless, even though she toiled endlessly over her homework, striving for perfect grades, desperate to escape her circumstances, desperate to prove her worth. The sting of those words, those labels, etched not just in chalk, but deeply into her very soul, had followed her for years, shaping her self-perception, fueling a quiet, burning determination to prove them all wrong, to rise above the judgment. And beside her name, almost as frequently, was that of David Miller. David, a spirited, bright-eyed boy with unruly blonde hair and a mischievous, almost impish grin, was invariably labeled lazy. David, who often daydreamed out the window, his mind clearly in another, more interesting world, whose homework was perpetually lost in the depths of his disorganized backpack, but who possessed a creative spark, a raw artistic talent, and an innate kindness that Mr. Harrison never once acknowledged, never once encouraged. Their names, side by side, a silent testament to their shared daily torment. Now caring for the man who had inflicted so much emotional pain, so much childhood trauma, Maria found herself battling a fierce, almost unbearable internal conflict. Her professional ethics, the very core of her being, demanded unwavering compassion, profound empathy, and the utmost quality of care. But the raw, unhealed wounds of her childhood, the silent screams of a shamed little girl, rebelled violently against these demands. Every time she changed his soiled linens, every time she carefully helped him eat, every time she gently adjusted his pillows for comfort, she saw not the frail, helpless old man, but the stern, judgmental figure at the front of the classroom, his lips perpetually pursed in disapproval, the chalk dust clinging to his perpetually tweed jacket. Sometimes, Mr. Harrison, lost deep within the labyrinthine fog of his dementia, would mumble phrases that sent a chill down Maria's spine, making the hairs on her arms stand on end. "Order, children, order," he'd bark, his voice thin and reedy, a ghost of its former booming authority. Or, "Such sloppiness, absolutely unacceptable. Discipline must be maintained." These were the very pronouncements that had often accompanied the harsh, screeching chalk scrawl of their names onto the board. Maria would clench her jaw, swallow the bitterness that rose in her throat, and remind herself, almost as a mantra, "He is a patient. He is helpless. My professional duty is to care." But the echoes were relentless, a haunting melody of past injustices. Maria also remembered the broader context of their school. The principal, Mr. Henderson, a portly man with a perpetually furrowed brow, seemed either oblivious or indifferent to Mr. Harrison's methods, often praising his tough discipline in faculty meetings. Other teachers, like Mrs. Gable, a kind elderly woman who taught art, would sometimes offer a fleeting, sympathetic glance to the shamed students, a small, unspoken apology in her eyes, but she never intervened, never challenged Mr. Harrison's authority. Maria learned early on that silence, even from the well-meaning, could be just as painful as direct cruelty. Part 3. Shared Scars, a Glimmer of Understanding. One quiet afternoon, while assisting a different resident in the brightly lit common room, Maria glanced across the room and saw a familiar face, a face that immediately stirred another wave of memory. David Miller, her old classmate, her fellow sinner on the chalkboard of shame. He was seated in a wheelchair by the window, staring blankly outside, his gaze lost in the hazy distance. His once unruly blonde hair was now sparse and white, a wispy halo around his head, and his mischievous, impish grin was replaced by a vacant stare, a characteristic of his advanced dementia. David was also a patient at Rosewood, though his dementia was more profoundly debilitating than Mr. Harrison's. Maria had recognized him weeks ago, but until now, the full, cruel irony of their shared fate hadn't truly settled in. She and David, the two most frequent, most publicly shamed visitors to Mr. Harrison's infamous board, were now under the same roof. The man who shamed them now completely dependent on their kind, empathetic care. Occasionally, in a moment of fleeting clarity, or perhaps just a quirky, misfiring neuron of his fading memory, David would look at Maria, his eyes momentarily focusing, piercing through the fog. "Maria," he'd murmur, his voice incredibly thin, yet distinct. "Did you get your name on the board today?" "He called me lazy again, Maria. Always lazy." It was a heartbreaking echo, a shared scar, a testament to the visceral reality of their childhood trauma. Maria would simply nod, her throat tight with a complicated mix of sadness and empathy. "Yes, David, he did. He always did." Their shared past, so humiliating then, now created a strange, poignant bond, a quiet, unspoken understanding that transcended the barriers of illness. In this shared memory, Maria felt a little less alone in her lingering hurt. One day, while performing the meticulous, almost ritualistic task of tidying Mr. Harrison's room, a task she approached with a complex mix of professional dread and an almost obsessive care, Maria noticed a small, worn, leather-bound notebook tucked beneath a stack of old, dusty textbooks in his bedside table. It wasn't a diary in the traditional sense, but a collection of meticulous notes, observations, and musings, dated from his active teaching years. She hesitated, her professional ethical boundaries warring fiercely with her undeniable, almost irresistible curiosity. Is this an invasion of privacy? But the powerful urge to understand the man who had shaped so much of her painful past, who continued to haunt her present, was simply too strong to resist. She found pages filled with strict classroom rules, detailed disciplinary procedures, and chillingly precise lists of student deficiencies. Her name and David's appeared frequently, accompanied by the familiar searing annotations. Maria R., consistent uncleanliness, pervasive lack of diligence. David M., consistent laziness, profound lack of focus. But as she delved deeper into the faded, cramped handwriting, she found other entries, more personal, more revealing. Scrawled notes about his own profound frustrations, the inherent chaos of the world. "I must impose order where I can, where I have control." Parents today, utterly lacking in discipline, utterly irresponsible. There were poignant, brief mentions of personal disappointment, of unfulfilled ambitions he had once held for himself, a failed attempt at a doctoral degree, a lost promotion to principal, a particularly bitter public divorce, and a profound, overarching sense of disillusionment with the rapidly changing world around him. A world he no longer understood. He seemed to view the classroom as his last bastion of control, a tiny, shrinking kingdom where he could impose rigid order on the perceived chaos of life. The chalkboard, she realized with a chilling yet profoundly empathetic understanding, was not just about the students. It was fundamentally about him, his desperate need for control, his projection of his own anxieties, his own failures, onto the innocent, impressionable children before him. It didn't excuse his cruelty, not by a long shot, but it began to humanize it, to frame it within the context of a deeply unhappy, perhaps even tormented man. Part 4. The Unexpected Witness, a Glimmer of Redemption. Weeks later, another familiar face appeared at Rosewood. Sarah Jenkins, another former classmate, now a well-heeled woman in her late 50s, arrived to visit her ailing mother, another long-term resident of the facility. Sarah had been the antithesis of Maria and David, the golden girl, always impeccably dressed, her name never once gracing the chalkboard of shame, always the first to raise her hand with the correct answer. The teacher's pet. She recognized Maria in the hallway, her eyes widening with genuine surprise and a hint of something unreadable. Perhaps recognition, perhaps a flicker of old, unacknowledged guilt. "Maria Rodriguez?" Sarah exclaimed, her voice filled with a mixture of shock and nostalgia. "Is that really you? My goodness, you haven't changed a bit. Still so calm, so serene. I would have recognized you anywhere." They exchanged pleasantries, a polite, almost awkward catching up after decades. Then Sarah's eyes fell upon Mr. Harrison, who was being wheeled past them by another aide, his face ashen, his gaze distant. A shadow, heavy and immediate, crossed Sarah's face. "Oh, Mr. Harrison, I heard he was here. He was quite a character, wasn't he?" Her voice, usually so bright and confident, was laced with a forced lightness that completely belied the discomfort in her eyes, the sudden tension in her shoulders. "I remember that chalkboard. He was so harsh to some of you. To you especially, and to David. I always felt bad about it. I truly did. I was just too afraid to say anything. Of course, we all were. He was so incredibly intimidating, wasn't he?" She sighed, a deep, genuine note of regret permeating her voice. "He was particularly hard on the troublemakers, as he called them, or anyone who didn't fit his very narrow, rigid mold of what a good student should be. My mother used to say he was a deeply unhappy man, full of bitterness about something or other in his own life. Projected it all onto us children, she said, because he couldn't control his own world." Sarah's words were a profound validation, a powerful confirmation that Maria hadn't imagined the pervasive unfairness, the constant cruelty, the unjust labels. Even the good students, the favored ones, had seen it, had felt the pervasive fear, had recognized the injustice. Even if they hadn't dared to speak out, it was a small, quiet act of acknowledgement that in its own way began to chip away at the stubborn layers of old hurt, starting the slow, painful process of healing. Part 5. The Brief Glimmer, the Silent Absolution. Days melted into weeks, and Mr. Harrison's condition slowly, inexorably deteriorated. His periods of lucidity grew shorter, his moments of awareness almost non-existent. One quiet afternoon, Maria was meticulously shaving Mr. Harrison's face, a delicate task that required immense patience, a steady hand, and a profound gentleness. The room was silent, save for the soft hum of the electric shaver and the distant sounds of the nursing home. David Miller was also in the room, wheeled close to the sunlit window, softly humming a tuneless, childlike melody, his head resting against the back of his chair, lost in his own world. Absent-mindedly, Maria began to softly hum an old elementary school song. One they used to sing at morning assembly, a simple, nostalgic tune that always brought a flicker of warmth to her heart. Suddenly, Mr. Harrison stirred. His eyes, usually distant and unfocused, turned slowly, deliberately towards Maria. For a brief, terrifying moment, they seemed to clear, like a sudden break in a dense fog. A spark of lucid recognition flickered within their cloudy depths, a painful, almost desperate awareness. He looked at her, truly saw her, not as a faceless caregiver, but as Maria. His thin lips parted, a faint, almost imperceptible sound escaping. "Maria," he whispered, his voice incredibly weak, but distinct, undeniably clear. He closed his eyes, then opened them again, looking from Maria to David. Miller, lazy. No, not lazy. A long, agonizing pause. He seemed to struggle for words, for air, for meaning. Order, important. Chaos, out of control. His gaze, now tinged with a profound, almost childlike vulnerability, returned to Maria, and for a fleeting, heartbreaking moment, a complex, unreadable expression passed over his face. Perhaps regret, perhaps remorse, perhaps a flicker of agonizing self-awareness. He couldn't form a coherent apology, couldn't articulate the words that might have cleansed his past, but the raw, naked vulnerability in his eyes, the subtle tremor in his hand that reached out weakly, then dropped, spoke volumes. It was not a grand redemption, not a theatrical confession, but a silent acknowledgement, a brief, fragile bridge spanning the decades of silence and pain. Part 6. The chalk dust settles. Maria stood frozen, the shaver still in her hand, her own breath caught in her throat. The moment of clarity, brief as it was enough. It was more than enough. Mr. Harrison was not just the cruel, judgmental teacher of her past. He was a deeply complex, tragically broken, perhaps profoundly unhappy and lonely man who had projected his internal struggles, his crippling fear of losing control, his own unfulfilled ambitions, onto his unsuspecting students. His chalkboard of shame had been his desperate, misguided attempt to impose order on a world he perceived as spiraling out of control, a distorted reflection of his own internal turmoil and unmet expectations. It had been his twisted, yet desperate way of coping, of wielding authority where he felt utterly powerless in his own life, caring for him, for the very man who had once publicly humiliated her and etched his harsh judgment onto her very soul, had become not an act of revenge, but an act of profound professional duty, yes, but more importantly, an act of personal, quiet, and deeply meaningful forgiveness. It wasn't a forgiveness sought or earned by him, but a forgiveness given freely, born of understanding and a boundless compassion that surprised even Maria herself. She understood now that her steadfast care, her unwavering empathy, this was her way of truly healing the old wounds, not just her own, but perhaps, in some small, immeasurable way, his too. She was giving him in his frail, final days a measure of the gentle understanding and human warmth that he himself had been so incapable of bestowing upon others. The following days and weeks brought a quiet, yet profound sense of liberation to Maria. The phantom ache in her chest, the lingering bitterness that had resided there for so long, finally subsided. The haunting echoes of dirty and careless faded, replaced by the quiet, comforting hum of her own inherent worth and the profound dignity of her compassionate work. She continued to care for Mr. Harrison with the same meticulous professionalism, the same gentle touch, but now the corrosive bitterness was completely gone. The profound irony of their shared fate was no longer a cruel joke, but a powerful, deeply resonant lesson in the human condition, in the complexities of life, and in the enduring, transformative power of empathy and understanding. David Miller, her old classmate, continued to drift in and out of his own fractured memories, sometimes calling out for her, sometimes for Mr. Harrison, but always with a gentle spirit, his former mischief, now a faint, nostalgic glow. Sarah Jenkins continued her regular visits, sometimes exchanging quiet, knowing glances with Maria, a silent, unspoken acknowledgement of their shared history and the lingering, yet now less burdensome, weight of those memories. The chalkboard of shame had been a tangible symbol of childhood humiliation, a dark, oppressive shadow over Maria's youth, threatening to define her. But in the quiet, compassionate corridors of Rosewood, bathed in the soft glow of understanding, that shadow finally began to dissipate, to melt away like morning mist. Maria, the once dirty girl, the careless student, had, through her unwavering dedication and profound empathy, become the living embodiment of care and kindness, proving that integrity, not cruelty, ultimately triumphs. Her resilience, her quiet strength, and her boundless capacity for human connection had not only served her patients, but had also profoundly healed a deep, personal wound within herself, transforming a painful, unjust past into a powerful testament to the enduring strength of the human spirit. The chalk dust had finally settled, leaving behind a legacy not of shame, but of forgiveness, understanding, and the quiet, radiant light of a soul at peace.